Hey guys, Mallow here once again. I've got somewhat of a longer video for you guys today because I have to sum up the entire experience I've had with this Ignite-based Trickster for the past 3 days because it basically just leveled way too fast and got from level 1 to 91 in just under 3 streams. So typically in 3 streams I'd be maybe something like level 80. This time around I have already leveled so fast that I'm at level 91, I've done most of the end game, and I've put the character to the test. So I do want to sum up my experience with Ignite so far in this patch. So Incursion, this entire patch, Ignite got somewhat of a rework and should be brought up to much healthier standards where you can actually do some good Ignite damage, some good clearing, but the single target still seems to be a bit lacking unless you're using some fairly overpowered Ellie hit or let's say attack damage stacking mechanics. So this character is just plain Fireball, Incinerate, Flameblast, that sort of thing, as a Trickster with some Ignite scaling, and Fireball definitely has seemed to be the king of the clear and single targets for this type of Ignite build, because Flameblast just has a bit too little area and playability, functionality, all of that with the having to channel and all that. Same with Incinerate. Incinerate's area is pretty shit, just standing still and channeling feels bad. Fireball gets all of its top end damage front loaded with one hit. You have huge amounts of Ignite scaling there, you hit very hard, and then there's a lot of Ignite damage built into it, so you don't have to wait for 8 stacks, 10 stacks, any bullshit like that with Incinerate and Flameblast. Instead with Fireball you just hit it once and boom, you're doing all of your Ignite damage. So as well as that, it's very ranged, you can get a lot of spread with the GMP, and then there's the Threshold Jewels that help the explosion, and you've also got Val Fireball, which helps you clear a lot of this shit too. So you can see that this type of stuff is a double beyond map. I've done a lot of double beyond mapping on this character simply because Ignite and Ignite Prolif shits all over double beyond and huge pack sizes and huge monster sizes, and I've been pulling something like 400 million an hour minimum, all the way from level 70 up to 90, so it's been just extremely fast to map with and extremely satisfying for the burn prolifs. Now you can see at the moment I am using an Impresence. That's what the dark circle was around the character, because this, to begin with, the entire character was built around anger, Impresence, a bit of flat fire scaling. Ultimately, I did have to drop that, and currently the version you see of the character is with Elemental Equilibrium. So we then take out Anger, we take out all of the flat damage scaling because you can't have that with Elemental Equilibrium, and I'll explain that with the gearing section later in the video. But essentially, Elemental Equilibrium is going to be the way to go for this type of Ignite scaling build, and you just can't really justify using things like Anger in the absolute endgame. So there should be a sufficient enough amount of clips here to show you just how good the clear for Ignite is right now. Trickster makes it a lot nicer thanks to the sustain you can get from Mind Over Matter, the life gain on kill, the mana on kill, the huge amount of regen from both your life and mana as Trickster, and all of the movement, attack speed, and all of that for your shield charge. So I think Trickster is a superior option for Ignite at the moment over Elementalist. Though Elementalist has its own benefits, Trickster should just have too many quality of lives, and the Ignite Prolif gem means that you don't really miss out on any damage for Ignite whatsoever. So then we get into the single target, and essentially it's not that great. It's not bad. You can still clear, I think, everything, because at this stage I've done a tier 13 Elder, all of his Guardians, tier 16 Guardians, and Shaper. I just have not taken on Uber Elder, and it's been okay. It hasn't been terrible, but it's really not that strong, especially compared to some of the other single targets out there right now. The single target here ends up essentially playing similar to an Essence Drain character, or what Essence Drain used to be like. You throw out one Essence Drain, and then you run around in circles for a while. So there's really not a lot for you to do. If you can get a Scorching Ray totem down, that's great. Keep your Orb of Storms down for Elemental Equilibrium, also great. But essentially, you're just running around, you're throwing one fireball out there, it burns for 10 seconds or whatever, you throw out another one, and it's just kind of a safe playstyle and a bit of a slow one. So you're never going to be blowing these bosses up too fast, because there's definitely a cap on how much ignite damage you can have, as I am using some pretty nasty ignite damage scaling with a +4 tabula and a level 21 fireball, and this is as good as it gets. It's not the greatest, but it's not bad. It's doable. And then we have here a tier 13 Elder, so you can see the actual prolif works really nicely, so we kill the portals very efficiently with the adds very efficiently, so I think it is stronger than an Essence Drain single target, and just for its playstyle with the prolif and the amount of damage that it does do, but it just feels very similar in playstyle to the Essence Drain type character, because yeah, it's just a lot of running around and biding your time, as you're basically just a damage over time character at this point, with pure ignite fire damage scaling, no real crit to speak of, and you can make it a bit tankier if you really want, much more mana, much more regen life gain. And yeah, after having done the tier 16 Guardians, the Elder, and as well as that Shaper, I am led to believe I could probably do Uber Elder, and I'm going to try that today, but it's probably not going to be a very good one. Who knows, maybe the playstyle would be just right suited to Uber Elder action. It's really going to depend largely on how profusely disappointing the actual ignite damage against those bosses will be, because if I have to take 30 seconds per phase just to get down 25% life, it's probably going to be way too rough. So you can see ignite damage, it's there, at least on Fireball, when you scale it appropriately enough. It's mostly about the clear speed. The clear speed, the ignite prolif for actual clear is pretty insane, and I can recommend that for sure if you just want a really fast mapping character. If you want like insane clear speed, if you want really efficient beyond farming, then the ignite prolif is definitely something to look into. You can play Elementalist, you can play Trickster, shit, you can probably play a few other things, because the Ignite Prolif gem is actually fairly strong right now. And then one last little clip I've got for you guys is a Phoenix fight. This one has like, it was corrupted with a bunch of mods. It's got like 50% life. It's got vulnerability permanently. It's got a bunch of damage. It's like hexproof. So it's a pretty tanky Phoenix. It's pretty high on damage as well. And you can see the playstyle is essentially just keep up your fireball, get your ignite onto the enemy, and run around. And it is a fairly safe playstyle in the end. I do nearly die a few times because shit, it's a very dangerous map. But yeah, the actual playstyle itself definitely works towards something like an Essence Drain, where you can run around and just you know, pick your battle, pick your time to attack, pick your time to run away, and all of that. But yeah, not terribly fast, it just does work. And ultimately you can see I found the Dying Sun, and a Dying Sun while taking out GMP and then turning it into pretty much pure single target while having a couple of extra proj is probably the best way to play this build, because GMP is fine, it's just it starts to feel a little worse in the tier 16 plus maps. When you're actually clearing really heavy trash with still a GMP in there, you kind of want a pure 6-link by that point. Now I do have quite a lot to go over here because I have to explain everything about Ignite and what I've learned as I've played it, but as per usual, this is currently a level 91 character, it's a Trickster, and I hate saying, you know, this is the fastest shit I've done over and over again, but if it keeps getting faster and it keeps actually progressing through characters, then shit, I have no choice. This character did hit level 91 within 18 hours, and as well as that has already done most of the end game content. The mapping was just too goddamn fast, and I could not really control that simply because Ignite, Fireball, Prolif, it's just way too fast compared to some of the other shit I've done recently. And ultimately, with something like this +4 Tabula, which gives me, you know, an additional 4 on my Fireball, leveling this thing was just a beast. I did my Cruel Lab at level 40, I did my Uber Lab at level my Merc Lab at level 50 and my Uber Lab at level 60. So I was drastically underlifed and under-leveled for all of those labs because items like this and just the playstyle of a Prolif damage over time character is so defensive if you really want it to be, that you can actually do most of that type of shit very early on. So for the most part, this level 21 Fireball I bought is just for my actual end game single target, but usually I'm running around with a fireball and a Val fireball for mapping because that's just how it's better. Currently it's only level 19, doesn't really need to be level 20 even for most of the content. And if you can't get the tabular, which probably you can't because they're rare, then a lore weave is fine and plenty of other stuff will do too. The +4 is fairly huge, but doesn't really carry me at this point. It's just I wanted to make the best possible ignite single target damage I could with Fireball to test it, and this is what we're at. A lore weave would be a pretty good secondary option as well. So in any case, currently we are built around ignite as a Trickster. Now you might think Elementalist is usually the way to go, and I think it is quite commonly, but at the moment the damage that you get from Patient Reaper as well as Prolonged Pain is very similar to what you get from the Elementalist. As well as that, you then get Weave the Arcane, which is a lot of extra mana, attack speed, cast speed, and some nice quality of life mapping over here. And then this Recover Max Life, Max Mana is super quality of life for mana as for mapping as well, and it makes it pretty hard for you to die. And then ultimately, the reason that we can do this is because of the new support Ignite Prolif. 40% more damage with Ignite, and then a 20 radius Prolif. So it takes over the Elementalist and gives you quite a lot of extra Ignite damage. And the reason this can work is because it's such a strong gem that if you were using an Elementalist, you'd have a weaker gem in there for Ignite damage for the most part, and you're not really losing any damage by using this. You're actually gaining a bit and then have a stronger Prolif. So this is what Elementalist will offer you anyway, but then Trickster offers you a bunch of other fun shit too for your actual mapping, so then you can easier build into Mind Over Matter. Don't have to worry so much about your life total, since we have 4.5k life, 2.3k mana unreserved, and that's with a tabular on. So you can get a much more defensive and much more mapping-based character, but this is just how I've tried with this Trickster and how it's worked out for me so far. You can still do an Elementalist, but I just wanted to do a Trickster because it looked like it'd be a bit faster and smoother. And then the stuff I need to talk about is how we actually scale our Ignite. So you have your Fireball or Flameblast, Incinerate, whatever it is, and you just get a bunch of fire damage, elemental damage, burn damage on your tree. So we're not crit at all, you got a bit of damage over time as well, and you go for all of the damage over time, elemental damage and fire damage that you can throughout the tree, the really big nodes, and then as well as that, in the end, we went Elemental Equilibrium. Now initially I thought, if you go Elemental Equilibrium, you can't get any flat fire damage shit. So things like Anger that actually give you, you know, like 50 to 100 additional fire damage to your spells cannot work because that will affect your Orb of Storms, and then Orb of Storms will be hitting with fire damage every time, thus reapplying fire resistance. If you want Elemental Equilibrium to work, you have to have no flat damage, so the Orb of Storms is only lightning damage, and then it constantly reapplies fire weakness. So originally I thought maybe I could outscale that because things like this jewel with Anger is a bonus 60% fire damage at its max. With Anger, and then Anger itself is big. You got some Temple Gloves that do additional fire damage. You have Impresence Amulet, which I was using, that does additional fire damage. In the end, it's all just going to be worse than Elemental Equilibrium, so I had to drop it. Still using this Watcher's Eye because it's pretty good for the Clarity mod, but it's not really worth it in the end unless you are purely mapping, because for pure mapping and lots of clear speed, no Elemental Equilibrium and using the fire damage stacking shit and Anger and all of that is going to be faster, but for your single target, this is much better. So you got to basically turn your playstyle into charge around, drop Orb of Storms all the time, and shoot out your fireballs. And for the most part, we do use GMP with our fireball. This is the No MTX fireball, and it works really nicely up until about tier 16. That's when you really start to notice a bit of a slowdown on some single target in maps, and that's when you might be able to sub in your Swift Affliction and then start running a Dying Sun. But up until that point, my 5th flask slot doesn't even matter at all. It's just Diamond Flask for easier elemental overload procs, but otherwise you can get defensive flasks. You can make it, you know, pretty much choose your own adventure there. Can really be flexible with that flask slot quite comfortably. As for the rest of the setup, it's pretty normal, I'd say, pretty basic. You just got yourself a Catalyst. It's going to be really hard to beat Catalyst for a weapon, even with some of the crazier weapons out there. So Catalyst is just fine. Then you try and get fire damage everywhere you can. So fire damage there, there, and then a fireball helm. Tried to craft my own belt just for life and resist and all that, an elder belt. Just grabbed some gloves that pretty random with mana, life, and then I crafted, well, slammed these boots just for nice movement speed, life, and resist with a bit of spell dodge. Overall, I've got a lot of spare sockets right now as well. I think I have like 4 or 5 spare sockets, which you can put a cast when damage taken or mortal call setup in, and I strongly recommend you do, because you really do need the help from that immortal call in a lot of situations. I've just not done it yet through pure laziness. And there's a few other things you can do too, like a Scorching Ray totem over here, which helps stack some negative fire resist. So Scorching Ray, spell totem. I've got a totem resist and totem and minion resist support here, and then faster casting. Then as well as that, we have Flammability attached to Arcane Surge, Curse on Hit, and Orb of Storms. So your Orb of Storms will proc an Arcane Surge, it will also proc your Elemental Equilibrium, and it will also apply Flammability. So Orb of Storms in this setup is pretty dang important, as you can imagine. And then we've also got our actual Fireball setup. So it's Fireball attached to Ignite Prolif, attached to Burn Damage, to Deadly Ailments, GMP, and Combustion. And then lastly, when we actually go single target, you swap out GMP for Swift Affliction, and that ends up being our highest single target setup. So in the end, our current single target looks like this: 400,000 ignite damage against a Shaper level target. And that might not seem like a lot, but for damage over time abilities and such reliable damage that's pretty much always going to be happening, that's actually not too bad, and it does feel better than, let's say, a 400,000 damage to an attack-based build, because those are usually going to be situational based off of flasks, charges, crits, all of that, whereas this one's pretty much reliable, and it's going to be very similar to, let's say, a Scorching Ray type of feel. Now, one other thing I would like to mention is that if you're going to play around with this sort of thing in your path of building, to get Elemental Equilibrium to work, you do have to tick enemy was hit by lightning damage, and then ignore skill hit damage. So that means it's going to ignore your Fireball constantly reapplying, because if you didn't, that means that it's going to have a bunch of additional fire resist, and that's shit, and you got to tick that so that your Orb of Storms is actually doing what it's supposed to. So you tick both of those, and you can get the effect of your Elemental Equilibrium over here. And then also just a couple of mentions about the jewels. I'm running 2 Rolling Flames right now. It's kind of overkill. I recommend getting at least 1. 2 feels better just for clear, but you definitely don't have to have 2, so that's just, you know, a bit of a personal preference. And then we have a Poacher's Aim as well, so that your fireball pierces 1 time rather than just exploding immediately, and that does help quite a lot for your quality of life on your single target map clearing as well. But for single target, you can replace all of these and get bigger fire damage jewels and all of that, so you could probably push 450k DPS with jewel swaps, but that just seems like too much work to me. So overall, I do still have to take on Uber Elder with this character and see how that goes. I don't think it's going to go great, and the single target being even as good as it is basically based around a +4 tabula, which is kind of a stupid expectation for me to have of anyone to you know, expect you to get one of these. Without the tabula, you're absolutely fine on mapping. The clear is still going to be amazing, and ignite should be really strong for your general mapping and clearing and enjoyment, but the single target's not really going to feel good for the end game. So my recommendation is that yes, you can play with Ignite. Yes, Ignite Prolif is pretty good for mapping, and it's back in some sort of a way there. I can strongly recommend it for most of your, you know, fast-paced leveling and all of that. If you want to take it to the end game, it's gonna feel pretty shit, at least in these spell-based type builds. I have seen evidence of some you know, pretty big ignites coming from, let's say, Ellie Hit, maybe some Stormfire conversion type bullshit, but from these just plain vanilla Fireball, Flameblast, Incinerate stuff, I have not seen too much evidence of strong endgame viability yet, at least not from my end, and I haven't really heard anyone say much about that. So that's a wrap up for the character basically, and my Ignite experience. I will probably have a video if it's a good Uber Elder kill, or if it's a kill at all. Otherwise, you probably won't hear from this character again, because I'm going to be moving on pretty soon to another one. This one has just leveled way too fast, and it's time to move on already. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video and the experience. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.